Have you ever felt like you've lost faith in the people you rely on the most? Well, that's a sentiment I can certainly relate to. You see, my parents kept a secret from me that I could have never fathomed. I know my story might sound unusual, but let me start from the beginning. My name is Claire, though my father always affectionately called me Princess Cassandra. My mom passed away a few years ago, a victim of a relentless battle with cancer. We did our best to care for her, but in the end, the disease claimed her. Since then, it had just been my father and me. Those initial days were filled with sorrow, and I remember crying myself to sleep countless times. We resided in a modest apartment, finding solace in simple pleasures like watching movies and sharing a pizza. My father would arrive home late, having put in long, exhausting hours at work. But when he did, he'd greet me with a warm embrace and ask, "How's my princess?" Followed by, "How's the kingdom?" He always made an effort to be cheerful around me, grinning and enveloping me in his affection. Those moments together were reassuring, and sometimes, during the quiet hours of the night, when my thoughts would drift to Mom and I'd shed tears, he would come to my room and offer soothing words, assuring me that everything would be all right and that Mom would forever reside in our hearts. My dad was a humble construction worker with a remarkable talent for revitalizing houses and transforming them into something beautiful. In my opinion, he was the standout performer at his company. Life was serene and uncomplicated during those days. Then one day, a few months after things began to regain some semblance of normalcy, my dad met a woman named Skylar. When he shared his feelings about her, his face lit up as if he had rediscovered a missing piece of himself. He stood taller, dressed more sharply, and spent increasing amounts of time with Skylar. I didn't mind because I was genuinely delighted to see him laugh and experience happiness once again. As time passed, he introduced her to me at a restaurant. She seemed decent enough, I suppose. However, she was worlds apart from being a replacement for my mother. However, Skylar undeniably made my dad happy, and that was what truly mattered. In my eyes, she came across as somewhat scatterbrained and frivolous. I couldn't quite grasp what Dad saw in her. But whenever I glanced at him, witnessing that smile outside our home, it felt like witnessing a rare occurrence. Such smiles had been an infrequent sight since Mom's passing. I had yearned to see him happy for so long, and as long as Skylar could make that happen, I was content. A few weeks after my dad and Skylar's initial meeting, she moved into our home. Yet, it was evident that she wasn't fond of our current residence. She frequently made sarcastic comments, suggesting that if we had more space, we wouldn't constantly bump into each other or comparing us to her affluent friends who possessed lavish home theaters and grand jacuzzis, luxuries we lacked. Soon after Skylar moved in, my dad announced that we were relocating to a new house. I was taken aback. Moving? How could we afford it? I knew how our financial situation stood. Whenever I asked my dad for things, he'd respond by saying he'd like to, but that we simply didn't have the money at the moment. It appeared as though he and Skylar had already made up their minds, and I wasn't granted a voice in the matter. This was a significant departure from our usual approach of discussing major decisions together. We used to create lists of pros and cons before reaching a joint decision. I felt deeply hurt that he hadn't even sought my opinion, not in the slightest. So, we all moved into this enormous house. It was colossal, filled with numerous rooms, adorned with marble floors, and featured ornamental columns inside, almost resembling a museum. My father described it as a palace for my princess, and my heart swelled with joy. I explored the house, rushing from room to room with my arms outstretched, counting the chambers, and my father playfully chased after me. Yet, as I lay in bed that night, my thoughts began to swirl. Something didn't quite add up. I knew my father wasn't particularly wealthy. I had seen similar homes on reality TV shows where celebrities and millionaires resided, but the situation left me bewildered. How were we suddenly able to afford a house like this? It seemed impossible. Everything looked so expensive, and it even came fully furnished, with a room just for me filled with all the dolls in the world. When I asked my dad how it was possible, he smiled and told me he'd received a significant promotion at work. I leaped into his arms, and we hugged tightly for what felt like an eternity. I was overjoyed by the news. I didn't dwell on our old life. This new chapter was truly amazing. With our move to a different area, I also had to switch schools. I was apprehensive about how the other kids would receive me. Would they accept me or would they ignore me? I didn't know anyone, and the school seemed vast, complete with swimming pools, 8 tennis courts, baseball and football fields, soccer fields, and a massive gymnasium. I needed to make new friends, join new clubs, and learn all the shortcuts to get around campus. Everything felt novel and unfamiliar, but with time, it became more manageable. This school was unlike my previous one. Here, everyone appeared sophisticated, with their fashionable shoes and expensive makeup. It felt like stepping into one of those Hollywood shows featuring privileged kids. And yes, they provided me with a uniform, complete with a skirt and a bow. It was acceptable, but I couldn't help feeling as if everyone was constantly scrutinizing each other. It was an odd and unsettling atmosphere that I had never seen portrayed in movies. One night, I overheard my dad and Skylar arguing in hushed tones, believing I couldn't hear them. Skylar called my dad cheap and lazy, but that just didn't make sense. He had never exhibited those qualities. He had provided us with this incredible house and everything we could wish for. We were living like royalty. That winter, my dad took me aside and delivered surprising news. We had to move once again. It was incredibly perplexing. We had only just settled into this grand, opulent house, and now we were on the move again. I couldn't comprehend what was wrong with the previous house. Moving again meant starting over at a new school, and oh my God, I had finally begun making friends. I had joined clubs, like the debate team, and we even had a game scheduled for next week. It felt like Skylar was the driving force behind this decision. My dad wouldn't do this to me. That must be why he was acting so strangely, and once again he hadn't consulted me. I was seething with anger at both of them, especially him. Why were they doing this to me? Why were they taking me away from my friends for the second time? It was unbelievable. When I confronted him with all my pent-up frustration, he yelled at me for the first time ever, telling me to stop acting like a baby and that we had to move. End of story. I was shocked. He frightened me. He had never acted this way before. He used to be as calm and serene as a monk. What had happened to him? We relocated to another sizable house, just as grand as the previous one, but with even more gadgets. It was one of those smart houses equipped with remote-controlled fireplaces, TVs embedded in the walls or descending from the ceiling in every room, and a pool that emerged when you pressed a button, along with an opening patio. However, none of these features held any appeal for me anymore. I considered them all frivolous toys. My anger consumed me. Once again, I had to adapt to a new school and don a new uniform. Everywhere I went, I could feel the eyes of my peers on me, the new girl. I had no one to rely on. All my friends were back at my previous school, and they seemed to have forgotten all about me in the midst of their dances and parades. I couldn't understand why Dad and Skylar were subjecting me to this ordeal once more. Didn't they realize how excruciating it was? It was a harrowing experience, like being forcibly torn away from the only good thing I had. I felt incredibly isolated. One evening, my dad heard my sobs, sat down beside me, and spoke in a soft, reassuring tone, saying, "Don't worry. Everyone loves you. You'll make new friends again." We had to move because of my job, my princess. "I only want the best for you," my dad explained. But I didn't care. I hated it here. I sobbed even harder. Then, in an attempt to cheer me up, he brought me my favorite peanut butter-filled chocolates and asked, "Who's my princess? Who can do anything?" I couldn't resist his sweet gesture and cracked a smile. He always knew how to make me happy. I hugged him tightly. One night, not long after we had moved into the new mansion, the house still feeling somewhat unfamiliar, I overheard my father and Skylar having an intense argument. It wasn't unusual to hear them argue, but this time was different. it was particularly bad. Skylar hurled awful insults at my dad, accusing him of always being poor, being a fraud, and claiming that everyone saw through him. In response, my dad called her a witch. She stormed out of the house, clutching her suitcase. My dad went after her but returned quickly. I was left bewildered by their heated exchange. Why would she say such terrible things? None of it made any sense. A few weeks after Skylar's departure, something incredibly strange occurred. I came home from school, and to my surprise, I saw unfamiliar people parking their car and entering our house. They were complete strangers to me, and my initial thought was that we were being robbed. I grabbed my cell phone, ready to call the police. But then I noticed my dad in the driveway, loading our car with all our belongings. I had no idea what was happening, so I rushed to him in a panic, exclaiming, "There are people in our house." However, he remained remarkably composed and instructed me to get in the car. As I rolled down the window, I saw him shaking hands with one of the strangers, and they seemed quite pleased with each other. The stranger's children seemed delighted and hurried into the house, including a girl slightly younger than me who carried a doll identical to one I had in my room. Everyone acted as if this situation was entirely normal, but to me, nothing made sense. Why had these people taken over our house? And why was my father seemingly so content with it all? I felt lost, not knowing how to make sense of it. My mind was in turmoil. When I finally mustered the courage to ask my father what had happened, he simply replied, "Not now, honey, not now." My thoughts were overwhelming, and I couldn't process anything. I couldn't help but recall the heated argument between my dad and Skylar back at the house, when she accused him of being a fraud and a liar. As we drove away from our home, we ended up at a small motel not far from the house we had vacated. We unpacked our things, and my dad instructed me to get settled in while he took a shower. Alone in the room, I sat on the bed and began to cry uncontrollably. The tears flowed freely, and I couldn't stop. Was my dad truly a dishonest person? A liar? Nothing about this situation made any sense to me. When my father emerged from the shower and saw me crying, he held me close, offering apologies and explaining that I was not meant to witness what had occurred. He revealed that his business had hit a slow patch, and we would need to stay in the motel for a short while, waiting for his next job to come in. He mentioned that his boss, Adam, whom I should remember, had assured him that the next house would be ready in a couple of weeks. However, a couple of weeks passed, and we remained without a permanent home. I was consumed by anger toward my father, and our strained relationship grew worse. Every evening when he called me for dinner, I would take my plate and eat silently in my room. How could I ever bring myself to talk to him again? How could I ever trust him? He had lied and cheated, and worst of all, he had lied to me, his self-proclaimed princess. Despite eventually moving to a small apartment, my feelings toward my father remained unchanged, and weeks had passed without us exchanging a single word. I began attending a public school in the neighborhood where the kids were more down to earth. Although it lacked the extravagance of my previous school, everyone there was friendly and welcoming. I joined clubs and made new friends, a skill I had honed over time. I would regale them with stories of my previous residence, and they all enjoyed hearing about the palace with a million rooms. One day, I entered the kitchen to grab a snack, finding my father engrossed in his laptop while on a speakerphone call. He was so absorbed in his work that he didn't even notice my presence. I overheard his conversation, and it was apparent that his boss was furious, angrily demanding to know why the house wasn't ready, why the construction team wasn't functioning correctly, and why the permits hadn't been signed. My father tried to explain but was cut off before he could say anything more. His boss ended the call, warning him, "You're on thin ice here, mister. Really thin ice." My father sat there silently for a moment, holding his head in his hands, and I could hear him crying. It was the first time I had ever seen him cry, and it shocked me to my core. I approached him and asked, "What's wrong, Dad?" He hastily wiped away his tears and replied, "It's nothing, honey. It's nothing. Just work." I hugged him tightly, and he returned the embrace. In that moment, I truly saw my father for the first time, and we began to talk. We had a real heart-to-heart conversation, one we hadn't had since Mom passed away. He expressed his deep remorse about the Skylar situation, explaining how she wanted to impress her affluent friends and feel wealthy. He confessed that Skylar pressured him into living in the houses he had repaired before the owners returned from their summer vacations. My father asked if I remembered all the brunches we had with Skylar's friends and revealed how she had threatened to leave him if he didn't comply. He was profoundly sorry and kept emphasizing how lonely he had felt and how he believed he had no other choice. I reassured him that I also felt lonely and that he would always have me. We continued to talk for hours. We ordered pizza and ice cream and settled in the living room. He promised that he would never do anything to make me feel lonely again. He acknowledged that it had been foolish of him to think it was okay to go along with Skylar's plans, especially since it meant nothing in the end. I agreed, realizing that sometimes adults could make irresponsible choices. I couldn't stay mad at my dad any longer.